The easiest way to reveal a person's character is to give them power and an audience. On a cold Thursday evening in Manhattan, Ethan Walker had both. The audience came first. 6 executives in tailored suits sat around a private corner table beneath a crystal chandelier, laughing a little louder than necessary at every joke he made. The power had been with him for years. At 38, Ethan was one of the most recognizable billionaires in the country, the founder of a technology empire worth more money than most people could imagine. He was the kind of man whose calendar was booked 6 months in advance and whose phone never stopped vibrating. Yet tonight, after closing a deal that had dominated the business headlines all week, he found himself unexpectedly bored. The restaurant was one of Manhattan's finest. White tablecloths, soft jazz, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. The kind of place where people celebrated promotions, anniversaries, and victories. Ethan should have been celebrating too. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and glanced around the room, searching for something, anything, to entertain him. That was when he noticed her. Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables carrying a silver tray. She wore the same black uniform as every other server in the restaurant. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. No dramatic gestures. No forced smiles. No attempt to stand out. Yet somehow she did. Maybe it was the calmness. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely unaffected by the expensive watches, luxury suits, and inflated egos surrounding her. While everyone else moved quickly through the evening, Claire moved with purpose. Steady, unhurried, as though she understood something everyone else had forgotten. Ethan watched her refill a water glass at a nearby table. She thanked a customer with a polite smile and continued on her way. She looks serious, one of his executives remarked after noticing where Ethan was looking. Maybe she knows she's serving the richest man in the room. The table laughed. Ethan smiled faintly. I doubt it. Another executive grinned. You should test that theory. More laughter followed. Ethan took a sip of sparkling water. The suggestion amused him. He had spent years reading people. Investors, competitors, politicians, journalists. Most of them revealed themselves within minutes. Pressure exposed character. Money exposed motives. A simple conversation usually exposed everything else. Maybe I will, he said. Across the room, Claire approached their table carrying a leather-bound menu requested by one of the guests. Her posture remained professional. Calm. Excuse me, she said softly. I believe someone requested our dessert menu. Ethan accepted the menu but didn't open it. Instead, a mischievous smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The executives recognized the expression immediately. Someone was about to become the subject of Ethan Walker's entertainment. Actually, Ethan said, glancing at the others. Before we order dessert, I have a question. Claire nodded politely. Of course, sir. Ethan folded his hands together. Let's say someone had more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Several executives chuckled. Claire waited. And let's say, Ethan continued, that person wanted to buy something truly valuable. Not a company, not a yacht, not an island. What would you recommend? The table burst into amused smiles. They knew exactly what he was doing. Testing. Playing. Looking for an awkward answer. Claire remained perfectly still. The city lights reflected softly against the windows behind her. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she looked directly at Ethan. Not at his watch. Not at his suit. Not at the executives surrounding him. At him. The laughter around the table gradually faded. Something in her expression made people stop talking. Claire tilted her head slightly. Her voice remained calm. Respectful. Almost gentle. I'd recommend finding out why someone with everything is still shopping. Silence settled over the table. Ethan's smile disappeared. Not dramatically. Not instantly. Just enough for the people closest to him to notice. Around them, glasses clinked softly. Jazz drifted through the restaurant. Somewhere in the distance, a waiter dropped a fork. But at that table, nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Because for the first time that evening, Ethan Walker realized he might not be the one asking the questions. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. The executives around the table exchanged uncertain glances, each waiting for someone else to laugh first. No one did. Claire simply stood there, holding her order pad with the same calm expression she had worn since approaching the table. There was no challenge in her eyes. No arrogance. No satisfaction. She had answered a question. Nothing more. Ethan leaned back slowly. That is an interesting answer, he said at last. Most people would have said a private island or a sports team. Claire offered a small smile. Most people assume value and price are the same thing. One of the executives chuckled nervously. And you do not. Claire glanced toward the city skyline beyond the glass windows. Thousands of lights shimmered against the dark evening sky. Not always. Then she politely excused herself and moved toward another table, leaving behind a silence that felt strangely heavier than before. Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd of diners. Something about the exchange bothered him. Not because she had embarrassed him. No, he had faced far tougher conversations in boardrooms filled with investors and competitors. What unsettled him was how easily she had answered, as though she had seen through the question before he even finished asking it. Well, one executive finally said, lifting his glass. That was unexpected. Ethan barely heard him. Across the room, Claire was helping an elderly couple decide on dessert. She listened patiently, smiled politely, wrote down their order. Then she moved on. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had just become the center of attention at the most important table in the restaurant. You are staring, another executive observed. Ethan looked away. I am curious. About a waitress? About someone who does not seem interested in impressing anyone. The executive laughed. Maybe she is just good at her job. Maybe. But Ethan had spent most of his life surrounded by people who wanted something. Investors wanted access. Reporters wanted stories. Politicians wanted donations. Even friends sometimes wanted opportunities. Motives were everywhere. Yet Claire had not tried to impress him. She had not asked who he was. She had not reacted when she realized the table was filled with powerful people. She had simply answered honestly. That was rare. More rare than most people realized. 20 minutes later, dinner plates were being cleared away. Coffee arrived. Conversations shifted from business deals to vacation homes and market forecasts. Still, Ethan found his attention drifting across the room. Each time he looked, Claire was doing something different. Helping a family celebrate a birthday. Refilling water glasses. Carrying trays. Speaking softly to customers. There was a quiet confidence about her. Not the confidence of someone trying to prove their worth. The confidence of someone who no longer needed to. Near the end of the evening, Ethan noticed a young busboy accidentally drop a stack of folded napkins beside a service station. The teenager froze immediately, embarrassment spreading across his face. Several guests looked over. Claire happened to be walking by. Without drawing attention to the mistake, she crouched down and began helping him gather the napkins. She said something Ethan could not hear. Whatever it was made the young employee smile. Within seconds, the moment had passed. No lecture. No criticism. No drama. Just kindness. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. Then he noticed something unusual. The busboy stood a little taller afterward, as though a simple act of respect had changed his entire evening. Ethan looked down at his untouched coffee. For reasons he could not explain, he suddenly found himself wondering who Claire Bennett really was. And for the first time that night, the answer felt far more interesting than any business deal he had signed that week. The restaurant finally began to quiet down after 10 o'clock. The laughter from business dinners faded. Empty wine glasses disappeared from tables. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath a blanket of amber lights and reflected rain. Inside, Claire Bennett continued moving through the dining room with the same steady rhythm she had maintained since the beginning of her shift. No one looking at her would have guessed how carefully she measured every dollar she earned. No one would have guessed that while guests discussed stock portfolios worth millions, she silently calculated whether this week's tips would cover her mother's physical therapy appointment. Claire finished clearing a table near the window and slipped through a service door into the staff hallway. The sudden quiet felt almost startling after hours of conversation and clinking silverware. She opened a small locker and pulled out her phone. One new message waited for her. It was from her mother. The text contained only a photo. A smiling woman sitting beside a hospital window, holding a paper cup of coffee. Beneath it were 4 simple words. Feeling stronger today, sweetheart. Claire stared at the image for several seconds. Then she smiled. A real smile this time. The kind she rarely showed customers. She typed back quickly. That is the best news I have heard all day. A few moments later, another server stepped into the hallway. Your mother? She asked. Claire nodded. Good day. A better one. The server smiled warmly. That is all we can ask for. Claire slipped the phone back into her pocket. She never talked much about her personal life at work. Most people knew only fragments. They knew she rented a small apartment in Queens. They knew she often picked up extra shifts. They knew she visited a rehabilitation center several times each week. Beyond that, she preferred silence. Not because she was secretive, because explaining everything required energy she no longer had. Years earlier, she had imagined a very different future. A future filled with lecture halls, graduate programs, and ambitious career plans. Then life had changed direction. Medical bills arrived. Family responsibilities followed. Dreams were postponed. Some disappeared entirely. Yet Claire had never considered herself unlucky. Tired sometimes. Frustrated occasionally. But not unlucky. She still had people she loved. She still had purpose. To her, that mattered more than status. Back in the dining room, Ethan Walker remained seated long after most of his guests had left. 2. Executives were still discussing numbers near the end of the table, but Ethan was barely listening. His attention drifted repeatedly toward the service station where Claire organized receipts and prepared closing paperwork. The more he observed her, the more confusing she became. She did not behave like someone impressed by wealth. She did not behave like someone intimidated by success. She seemed entirely comfortable standing exactly where she was. That quality fascinated him. Ethan had spent years chasing larger goals. Bigger companies, bigger markets, bigger victories. Every achievement led immediately to another target, another mountain to climb, another benchmark to surpass. Yet when Claire spoke about value earlier that evening, she had done so with a certainty he rarely heard from people in his own circles. As if she had already answered questions he was still asking. One of the executives closed his laptop. "You coming?" he asked. Ethan looked up. "In a minute." The man followed his gaze across the restaurant and laughed softly. "You were still thinking about that waitress." Ethan did not answer immediately. Through the glass partition, he could see Claire helping a dishwasher carry a heavy stack of menus back into storage. She thanked him afterward. The young employee grinned, as if she had done him a favor rather than the other way around. "Maybe," Ethan finally admitted. The executive shook his head. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think she is the first person all week who talked to you like a normal human being." Ethan looked back toward the city lights outside. For the first time all evening, he suspected his friend might be right. The next morning, Ethan Walker arrived at his office on the 52nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Midtown Manhattan. The city stretched beneath him like a living machine. Yellow taxis moved through narrow streets. Steam rose from rooftops. People hurried toward meetings, deadlines, and obligations. Usually, this view energized him. Today, it felt strangely distant. His assistant entered carrying a tablet and a folder filled with schedules. "Your 9 o'clock investor call is ready. The Chicago acquisition team arrives at 11, and the media interview was moved to 2 this afternoon." Ethan nodded without looking up. His attention remained fixed on the coffee sitting untouched beside his desk. "Anything else?" his assistant asked. Ethan hesitated. "There is a restaurant called L'Oran on Madison Avenue." She blinked. "The restaurant from last night?" "Yes." "What about it?" Ethan leaned back. "Nothing." Even as he said it, he knew it was not true. The question Claire had answered so effortlessly continued to linger in his mind. Not because it was clever, because it was accurate. He had spent years buying things people called valuable. Companies, buildings, investments, recognition. Yet he could not remember the last time any of them made him genuinely happy for longer than a few days. His assistant studied him carefully. "You are distracted." "Am I?" "You have checked the same email 3 times." Ethan almost smiled. "Maybe I did not sleep enough." The truth was less comfortable. For the first time in years, someone had challenged him without trying to challenge him. Claire had not argued. She had not criticized him. She had simply held up a mirror. And Ethan disliked how much he recognized in the reflection. Across the city, Claire stepped off a subway train in Queens carrying a canvas tote bag and a paper cup of coffee. The morning air felt cool against her face. She had worked late the previous night, but today was one of her rare afternoons off. Instead of sleeping in, she walked 3 blocks to a rehabilitation center tucked between a pharmacy and a grocery store. Inside, the smell of coffee and disinfectant filled the lobby. Claire signed her name at the front desk and headed upstairs. Her mother was waiting beside a large window overlooking a small courtyard garden. "You are early," her mother said with a smile. "You raised me to be responsible. I also raised you to sleep occasionally." Claire laughed softly and sat beside her. They spent the next hour talking about ordinary things. weather forecasts, television shows, neighborhood gossip, small moments that mattered more than they seemed. At one point, her mother noticed Claire staring quietly out the window. "Long night?" she asked. Claire considered the question. "Interesting night. Interesting good or interesting bad? I have not decided yet." Her mother smiled knowingly. "That usually means interesting good." Back in Manhattan, Ethan finished his final meeting just before sunset. Most people would have gone home. Instead, he found himself standing beside the window of his office watching the sky turn orange above the skyline. Then he did something unusual. He canceled a dinner invitation worth millions in potential business opportunities. His assistant looked shocked. "Are you sure?" she asked. Ethan grabbed his coat. "Very. Where are you going?" Ethan paused near the door. For the first time all day, a genuine smile appeared on his face. "I think I am going to ask a waitress another question." The dinner rush had already begun when Ethan stepped back into Laurent the following evening. The hostess recognized him immediately and offered the private dining section, but he declined. Instead, he chose a small table near the center of the restaurant. Somewhere ordinary. Somewhere he could observe without becoming the event himself. The hostess looked surprised but escorted him to the table anyway. As he sat down, he noticed Claire across the room arranging silverware for a newly seated family. She had not seen him yet. Ethan found himself oddly relieved. For the next 15 minutes, he watched the restaurant move around her like a river flowing around a stone. Customers arrived. Orders changed. Children spilled drinks. Managers answered questions. Through all of it, Claire remained calm, steady, present. There was no performance in her professionalism. No exaggerated enthusiasm. Just quiet competence. Eventually, she approached his table carrying a menu. Her expression remained neutral until she recognized him. Then one eyebrow lifted slightly. "You came back." Ethan smiled. "That sounds like an accusation." "Not an accusation." She set the menu down. "An observation." "Do you always answer questions with observations?" Claire considered that. "Only when the observation is more interesting." Ethan laughed softly. "You know, most people try very hard to impress me. Do they succeed?" The question caught him off guard. Not because it was rude. Because it was sincere. Ethan looked down at the menu before answering. "Sometimes." Claire nodded as though evaluating the answer. "That sounds exhausting." "Being impressed?" "Having so many people attempt it." Ethan stared at her for a moment. Again she had done it. Taken a conversation in a direction he never expected. "You have a habit of making simple questions complicated." Claire smiled faintly. "And you have a habit of assuming complicated things are simple." Before Ethan could respond, another table requested assistance. Claire excused herself and disappeared into the crowd. Yet the conversation stayed with him. Throughout the evening, their exchanges continued in brief moments. She recommended a soup. He asked why. She answered by describing the chef's passion rather than the ingredients. He asked whether she always focused on people instead of outcomes. She replied that outcomes usually reflected people anyway. Every answer revealed something unexpected. Not extraordinary intelligence in the academic sense. Something rarer. Perspective. At one point, an older customer approached Claire near the service station. The man appeared frustrated about a reservation misunderstanding. Ethan could not hear every word, but he watched the interaction closely. Claire listened without interrupting. She did not defend herself. She did not argue. She simply listened. After a few minutes, the customer nodded, smiled, and returned to his table. The tension disappeared completely. Ethan shook his head. Most executives he knew could not resolve disagreements that efficiently, even with entire legal departments helping them. Later, when Claire delivered his coffee, he finally asked the question that had been forming all evening. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "People leave conversations with you calmer than when they started." Claire looked at the coffee cup for a moment before answering. "Most people spend conversations waiting for their turn to speak. And you do not." "I try not to." She glanced toward the dining room. "Everyone carries something invisible. Stress, fear, regret, grief. If you listen long enough, they usually tell you what it is." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not discomfort, recognition. For years he had become an expert at persuasion, negotiation, influence. Yet listening had rarely appeared on the list. Claire started to leave, then paused. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan looked up immediately. "Of course." Her expression remained thoughtful. "When was the last time you spent an entire day without trying to win something?" For the second time in 2 nights, Ethan Walker found himself completely unable to answer. Claire's question remained in Ethan's mind long after he left the restaurant. When was the last time you spent an entire day without trying to win something? The city outside his car window blurred into ribbons of light as Manhattan drifted past. Normally, his evenings ended with strategy calls, market reports, and meetings scheduled weeks in advance. Tonight, he ignored all of them. Back at his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, he loosened his tie and stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The apartment was beautiful, expensive, impeccably designed. Yet the silence felt larger than usual. Ethan glanced around the room. Awards lined the shelves. Business magazines displayed his photograph on their covers. A framed newspaper article celebrated one of his biggest acquisitions. Every object represented a victory. Every object answered a question he had spent years asking. Yet none of them answered the question Claire had asked. The next morning began with the usual flood of emails and conference calls. Investors wanted updates. Analysts wanted projections. Reporters wanted comments. Ethan moved through each conversation efficiently, but something felt different. During a board meeting, he found himself studying the faces around the table. For years, he had evaluated people based on performance, results, and ambition. Now he wondered what invisible burdens they carried when they left the office. The thought was unfamiliar, distracting, human. By late afternoon, another opportunity appeared. A major client was visiting New York unexpectedly. The contract could generate hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan's executive team immediately organized a private dinner. Everything was arranged at Laurent, the same restaurant, the same evening. Ethan almost laughed at the coincidence. When he arrived, the private dining room buzzed with conversation. Executives exchanged handshakes. Investors discussed forecasts. Expensive watches flashed beneath warm lighting. Across the room, Claire moved quietly between tables. She had not noticed him yet. Ethan watched as one of his colleagues approached her with a playful grin. "You are the famous waitress," the man joked. "The one who keeps defeating our billionaire with philosophy." Several people laughed. Claire smiled politely. "I was not aware there was a competition." "Trust me," another executive said. "There is now." More laughter followed. Ethan observed carefully. This was the moment. A second test. Not from him directly this time, but from the world he represented. Wealth, status, ego, performance. The things Claire seemed strangely immune to. One of the investors leaned back in his chair. "Let me ask you something," he said. "If success is not about winning, as our friend Ethan apparently learned, what is it about?" Several heads turned toward Claire. The room expected another clever answer, another memorable line. Ethan noticed something important. Claire did not rush. She did not perform for the audience. She took a moment to think. Then she glanced around the table. "Success means different things to different people." "That sounds diplomatic," someone said. "Maybe." Claire folded her hands lightly. "But if your definition of success requires someone else to lose, eventually it becomes a very lonely definition." The room grew quiet. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. Ethan looked around and noticed several executives avoiding eye contact. One investor stared into his coffee. Another slowly nodded. Claire had not criticized anyone. She had not mentioned money. Yet somehow everyone understood the message. Ethan felt a strange mixture of admiration and frustration. Every time he expected a simple answer, she revealed a deeper question hiding underneath. Claire excused herself and continued working. The conversations around the table resumed, but something had changed. The energy felt softer, less competitive, less performative. As the evening progressed, Ethan realized something unexpected. He was no longer trying to figure out how to impress Claire. He was trying to understand her. And for a man who had spent most of his life believing every challenge could be solved with enough effort, that realization felt far more unsettling than any business negotiation he had ever faced. The following week brought an unexpected storm to Manhattan. Rain tapped against the restaurant windows while dark clouds settled over the city like a heavy curtain. Inside Laurent, warm lights reflected across polished floors and crowded tables. Business continued as usual. Yet something felt different between Ethan and Claire. The games had quietly disappeared. The teasing questions, the subtle tests, the need to prove anything. In their place was curiosity. Real curiosity. That evening, Ethan arrived alone again. No executives. No investors. No audience. He chose the same table near the center of the dining room. When Claire approached, she noticed immediately. "No entourage tonight?" she asked. "I gave them the evening off." "How generous of you." Ethan smiled. "I am trying something new." "And what is that?" "Listening more than talking." Claire looked genuinely surprised. "That sounds difficult." "It is. Most worthwhile things are." Before Ethan could answer, a manager hurried across the dining room carrying a stack of reservation sheets. His expression looked tense. Several employees gathered near the host's stand. Phones rang repeatedly. Something was clearly wrong. Claire excused herself and walked over. Within minutes, word spread through the restaurant. A software failure had erased dozens of reservations for the evening. Customers were arriving with confirmations the system no longer displayed. Frustration began building almost immediately. Guests waited longer than expected. Staff members rushed between tables. The atmosphere grew strained. Ethan watched quietly. He had seen similar situations before. In corporations, moments like these usually triggered panic, blame, and endless meetings. Here, the challenge was smaller, but the pressure felt just as real. Then he noticed Claire. While others moved faster, she slowed down. While voices became louder, hers remained soft. She approached confused customers one by one. She listened, reassured them, found temporary solutions. At one point, an elderly couple stood near the entrance looking disappointed after learning their anniversary reservation had disappeared from the system. Claire spoke with them briefly. Then she personally rearranged several tables and created space near a window overlooking the rain-soaked avenue. Within minutes, the couple was smiling. The crisis continued, but the tension around them vanished. Ethan found himself studying her again. Not because she solved problems. Plenty of people solve problems. What fascinated him was how she solved people. Nearly an hour later, the restaurant finally stabilized. The reservation issue was under control. Customers settled into their meals. Staff members breathed easier. Claire passed Ethan's table carrying a tray. "Busy night," he observed. "That is one way to describe it. You never seem stressed." Claire laughed softly. "That is because you only see the outside." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "So what is happening on the inside?" For a moment, she considered ignoring the question. Then she surprised him. "The same thing that happens to everyone else." "Which is?" "Worry, responsibility, uncertainty." She adjusted the tray in her hands. "The difference is that panic rarely improves any of them." Ethan watched her walk away. The words lingered. Panic rarely improves any of them. Later that evening, as customers finished dessert and rain continued streaking across the windows, Ethan happened to pass the staff hallway while leaving. The service door stood partially open. Through the narrow gap, he noticed a bulletin board covered with photographs. Family pictures, thank you cards, notes from employees. One image caught his attention. Claire stood beside an older woman in a rehabilitation center courtyard. Both were smiling. The photograph looked worn from being handled often. Ethan paused. Something about the image felt important, not because it revealed a secret, because it revealed what mattered to her. For the first time, he began to understand that Claire's calmness was not natural talent. It had been earned. Somewhere behind her quiet confidence was a story he had never heard. And for reasons he could not explain, he wanted to know it. The photograph stayed in Ethan's mind for days. Not because it revealed something dramatic, because it revealed something real. In a world where almost everyone seemed eager to display their accomplishments, Claire had pinned a simple picture of her mother to a bulletin board hidden behind a service hallway. No awards, no certificates, no evidence of sacrifice, just a reminder of who mattered. The thought followed him through meetings, conference calls, and business dinners. One afternoon, while reviewing proposals from 3 different investment firms, Ethan found himself staring out his office window instead of reading the reports in front of him. His assistant noticed immediately. "You have been distracted for 2 weeks," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "That obvious? You rejected a deal worth $80 million yesterday. It was a bad deal. You usually explain that in 12 slides." Ethan laughed. "Maybe I am evolving." She studied him for a moment. "Or maybe someone asked you a question you cannot stop thinking about." Ethan did not answer. The silence answered for him. That evening he returned to Laurent again. By now, the staff recognized him as a regular customer rather than a celebrity visitor. Some greeted him by name. Others simply nodded. Claire was helping a family celebrate a birthday when he arrived. He watched from a distance as she knelt beside a young girl and adjusted a candle that kept blowing out. The child laughed. Claire laughed too. It was a small moment. Easy to miss. Yet Ethan found himself watching it longer than necessary. Later, near closing time, the restaurant finally quieted. Most customers had gone home. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Claire brought over a fresh cup of coffee without being asked. "You know," she said, setting it down, "most people come here for the food. The food is excellent. Yet somehow you never talk about it." Ethan smiled. "You noticed." "I noticed things. I have gathered that." For a moment neither spoke. The comfortable silence surprised him. Usually silence felt like something that needed filling. Around Claire, it felt different. Then she glanced toward the empty dining room. "Can I ask you something? Another dangerous question?" "Possibly." Ethan nodded. "Go ahead." Claire folded her arms lightly. "Why do you keep coming back?" The question was simple. Honest. Ethan looked down at the coffee before answering. Weeks earlier, he would have offered a clever response. Something polished. Something safe. Instead, he told the truth. "Because most conversations in my life are negotiations." Claire remained quiet. "People want something," Ethan continued. "Money. Access. Opportunities. Approval." He looked around the restaurant. "You do not." Claire considered that carefully. "Maybe I just want different things." Ethan frowned slightly. "Such as?" She smiled. Not triumphantly. Not mysteriously. Just honestly. "Time with my mother." "Her recovery is going well?" Claire looked surprised. "You remembered." Of course I remembered. For a brief moment emotion flickered across her face. Then she nodded. "Better every week." Ethan noticed something then. Every time Claire talked about her mother, her entire expression changed. The guarded professionalism softened. The exhaustion disappeared. The answer came from somewhere deeper. "You gave up a lot for her, did you not?" he asked quietly. Claire stared out the window. The city lights shimmered against the wet streets below. Everybody gives up something for the people they love. Not everybody. Then they are missing out. Ethan sat silently. He had expected many things when he first walked into the restaurant weeks ago. Entertainment, distraction, maybe even a challenge. He had not expected perspective. He certainly had not expected humility. Claire glanced at the clock. Her shift was ending. "I should finish closing." Ethan nodded. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Claire." She looked back. "Yes." For the first time since that first evening, there was no trace of irony in his voice. No teasing. No test. "I owe you an apology." Claire blinked. "For what?" Ethan held her gaze. "The first night I came here, I thought I was evaluating you." A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "And?" Ethan looked around the nearly empty restaurant. Then back at her. "It turns out I was the one being evaluated all along." Claire stood still for a moment after Ethan's apology. Then she laughed softly. Not because she found it amusing. Because the honesty surprised her. "That is probably the most expensive lesson anyone has learned in this restaurant," she said. Ethan smiled. "You are probably right." The last few employees finished cleaning nearby tables. Chairs were stacked. Lights dimmed gradually across sections of the dining room. Outside, Manhattan continued moving at its usual speed. Horns echoed in the distance. Headlights reflected off wet pavement. Yet inside Loran, everything felt unusually calm. Claire picked up a folded linen napkin from a nearby table. "You know," she said, "most people think life changes because of one dramatic moment." Ethan listened carefully. "But it usually does not." She placed the napkin onto a service tray. "It changes because of hundreds of small moments that slowly teach us something." Ethan looked around the nearly empty restaurant. "And what did this one teach me?" Claire smiled. "That depends. Did you learn anything?" For a second, Ethan thought about giving a clever answer. Then he remembered how every meaningful conversation between them had started when he stopped trying to sound impressive. "I learned that I spent years measuring the wrong things." Claire waited. "I measured growth, revenue, market share, recognition." He glanced toward the window overlooking the city. "I became very good at counting things. And now I am starting to wonder if the most important things cannot be counted." Neither spoke for a few seconds. The silence felt comfortable. Earned. Eventually Claire nodded. "That sounds like progress." Ethan laughed. "You always make personal transformation sound incredibly ordinary." "Because it is ordinary." She shrugged lightly. "Most growth happens quietly." The words settled between them. Ethan realized that was exactly what had happened. No dramatic confrontation. No life-changing speech. No miracle. Just a series of conversations with someone who never cared about his title. Someone who treated him like a person instead of a headline. Several weeks later, spring sunlight spilled across Manhattan for the first time after a long stretch of rain. Ethan stood outside a rehabilitation center, holding a small paper bag from a local bakery. He checked the address one last time before walking inside. The receptionist smiled politely and pointed toward the courtyard garden. There, beneath a flowering tree, sat Claire and her mother. They were drinking coffee and sharing pastries. Claire noticed him first. Surprise crossed her face. Then curiosity. Ethan approached slowly. "I hope I am not interrupting." "You are," Claire replied. "But only because my mother was winning an argument." Her mother laughed. "Finally someone tells the truth." Ethan handed over the bakery bag. "Peace offering." Claire's mother accepted it with delight. Within minutes, the three of them were talking comfortably beneath the afternoon sun. No one discussed billion-dollar deals. No one mentioned stock prices. No one cared about status. They talked about books, favorite neighborhoods, terrible cooking experiments, ordinary things, human things. As Ethan listened, he realized something that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. For the first time in years, he was not trying to get somewhere else. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Later that evening, after saying goodbye, Ethan walked alone through the city. The skyline glowed against the fading light. People hurried past carrying groceries, chasing trains, meeting friends. Life continued in 1,000 different directions. He thought back to the first night he had walked into Lauren looking for entertainment, looking for a distraction, looking for someone to tease. Instead, he had found a mirror. And in that mirror, he discovered something worth far more than any deal he had ever signed. Because sometimes the people who speak the softest leave the deepest echo. And sometimes the ones who seem ordinary are the very people who quietly raise the standard for everyone around them.